Okay, I can see that we have an audience here, and let me just welcome you to the Spring Term Economics Sociology Colloquium series, which is sponsored by the Center for the Study of Economy and Society. And of course, I'm really delighted to introduce Woody Powell, and he's a professor of sociology and education at Stanford. And he is presenting today a paper co-authored with Aaron Horvath, Seeing Like a Philanthropist from the benevolence, from the business of benevolence to the benevolence of business. Interesting circle there. Woody is an organizational and economic sociologist whose publications have had a seminal influence in a number of important subfields of sociology. His article with Paul DiMaggio, The Iron Cage Revisited, published in 1983 in the ASR, launched an enormously productive cumulative research program on the new institutionalism in organizational theory. It is a program which continues to provide organizational sociology a shared theory and paradigm. Woody's view of institutions as the external memory of society that serve to focus collective attention to encode the mores and rules of the community and to enable coordination captures a distinctive sociological approach to the multidisciplinary discussion that seeks to explain why institutions matter for organizational and economic sociology. Woody has contributed numerous influential articles published in the AJS and organizational journals. His recently published book with John Padgett on the emergence of organizations and markets has been influential in bringing together three core literatures in sociology: organizational sociology, network analysis, and economic sociology. What I have found, and I've taught this book in graduate seminars at Cornell, what I've found alluring and significant in this work is the way it addresses the puzzle of how innovative activity in the emergence of novel organizational forms occurs in social processes involving overlapping networks of economic and organizational actors. Powell's work with graduate students at the University of Arizona and Stanford has not only produced the definitive study of the emergence of biotechnology as a new organizational form and industry, but he also has produced a new generation of sociologists in the fields of economic and organizational sociology. And lastly, introducing Woody to a Cornell audience is not only a pleasure, but it is an easy job because so many have read his work. So without saying more, Woody, it's great to have you through Zoom here at Cornell. I'm told that in the future it will be possible to have your holograph here once they get the 6G apparatus up and running. So, well, but better yet, we hope to see you in the future in person here in upstate New York. Woody?
Thank you, Victor. That's a very kind introduction. I appreciate it. Let me introduce my co-author, the first author of this paper. It's Aaron Horvath. Aaron, say something so your face will pop up.
I'm saying something so my face will pop up. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Aaron.
Aaron is a PhD student in sociology, finishing his dissertation here. He studies how the ideals of democracy are instantiated and often corrupted in organizations. He was an undergrad at Princeton where he worked with Viviana Zelizer, and he kind of combines economic sociology and historical sociology. And I think you're going to marvel at some of the pictures and the historical documents we have here, and those are all Aaron's doing. This is something we've worked on for a considerable amount of time. It appears in one form as a chapter in the nonprofit sector, a recent book out of Stanford University Press. I see Paul DiMaggio's on board. I appreciate Paul very much for many things, but he gave Aaron and me very detailed comments on this chapter. But we're also working on turning this chapter into a longer book, and you'll see today we try to bring it up to 2021 and what we call a turn to social justice. But let me jump in and get started. I don't see people very well on the screen. So if you want to just ask a question, you can either do it in the chat or you can just say, hello, hey, stop, I've got a question. So I don't mind that at all. If it's just clarification, I'll quickly do it. If it's long and substantive, we'll make the call whether to go ahead and finish or, but let's have this back and forth, even though it's, there's a lot of you. It's hard to make see everyone on the screen. So it's great to have so many people here. All right, so this picture, actually I blew it already. So let me go back. This picture here is from Puck Magazine. Puck Magazine was a muckraking, very popular magazine. If Paul DiMaggio was in his office at NYU, he would be in the Puck building. This is in fact where the magazine was published on the lower east side of Greenwich Village. And this is Puck helping Rockefeller purify his dirty money so it could be sent off to missions around the world. And it's pretty hysterical because he says he's filing for a patent on disinfecting dirty money. Roughly 100 years later, a little more than 100 years later, we get another magazine, Forbes magazine, with its special 30th issue of the Forbes 400, the titans of philanthropy. You see Bon Jovi and Bill and Melinda Gates and Warren Buffett and Oprah Winfrey. And then over on the right is Mark Andreessen and Laura Arriaga. And I have to be honest, I hold the Andreessen family chair here at Stanford as a co-director of a center, so I'm a beneficiary of this. But I think what struck Aaron and me was how in this earlier era, the initial philanthropists, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Stanford, Cornell, we could go along, were vilified in the popular press, deeply criticized for their transfer of money, of trying to take dirty money and make it clean, while today our philanthropists have been, it's changing in the past year or two, celebrated and turned into to heroes. So in an earlier paper, Aaron and I were struck by this contrast between Gilded Age philanthropy, people who were pilloried publicly, but nevertheless used their fortunes to build universities, museums, libraries, what we call contributory philanthropy. While the current super rich, who were valorized publicly, use their philanthropy frequently for anti-state and pro-market activities, what we call disruptive philanthropy. And we wanted to understand how do philanthropists transpose the practices they use to earn their fortunes into the organizational routines of their philanthropies, and then turn them into requirements for those who receive funding. And so in that sense, we're trying to understand how does the political influence of philanthropy both channel and enable the kind of critiques to which it's subjected. So we have drawn on an enormous array of data sources. Aaron's traveled around the country from New York State to the Rockefeller Archives, to Brookings, to Columbia, Library of Congress. And we're building a collection of foundation reports across the 20th century that we'll keep here at Stanford. So we've basically been archaeologists trying to encounter and uncover the early histories of philanthropy. And of course, there are an enormous number of memoirs and essays and autobiographies that we can draw on. Certainly the impact of philanthropic foundations has grown mightily in the US, really taking off in the 1960s and then exploding in the past 25 years. But even though much has changed, a lot remains the same. So let me walk you through three three eras real quickly here. On my left, with his wings, is Carnegie, with his commitment to the League of Nations and creating peace in our time after World War I, this audacious idea that there will never again be another war. The piece in the middle is the Ford Foundation. It's really an extraordinary document. Aaron found it. It's been checked out a fair number of times. It's a memo written. What would happen to social science and the humanities if Hitler wins? And it was a plan for the foundation to fund the snatching of 40 great social scientists and humanists from Britain and France and bring them to the US to protect knowledge if Hitler conquered all of Europe. We never, Aaron, we didn't find the list of who the top 40 were when we were incredibly curious about this, but clearly it was something discussed in 1940 at the foundation. And then on the right is a letter written to their young daughter by Priscilla Chang and Mark Zuckerberg, 2015, where they pledge their billions to eliminate, it's quite interesting to think of this in our current moment, this is in 2015, to eliminate disease in the lifetime of their daughter. So what you see across these are these grand, ambitious, glorious plans on the part of super wealthy philanthropists. So we want to try to understand, how can we analyze their visions over time? And to do that, we draw on, three kinds of ideas. They're very much the Mannheimian sociology of knowledge, place ideas in the context of their time. Stinchcombe's fundamental idea about imprinting, so that particular aspects of history determine the structure of organizations. And then the mantra from Paget and Powell: in the short run, actors create relations. In the long run, relations create actors. So we want to see how this combination of practices, organizations, and people creates ideas of philanthropy. And so we steal quite brazenly from Jim Scott, his extraordinary Seeing Like a State, to see if we can help explain how philanthropists see the world. So one of my favorite quotes about philanthropy is from Dwight McDonald. He says, "Foundations are a body of money completely surrounded by people who want some." And so, there's a really interesting feature of philanthropy is, as some philanthropists will say, they have enormous power because everybody has to like them in some respects. And at the same time, that power means that their understandings of the world are inevitably skewed. And so what we're trying to do is understand how the way in which the wealth of philanthropists gets distributed reflects the organizational routines of their organizations. We want to understand what the medium of exchange is. Here we borrow very much from Viviana Zelizer in terms of if you give money as a gift, if you give money as a grant, if you give money as an investment, those are not just distinctive forms, but they entail dramatically different relationships between the benefactor and the beneficiary. And how you refer to your recipients. One of the most interesting challenges philanthropists have is, who do they call the people they give money to? Are they a subcontractor? Are they a donee? Are they a grantee? Are they a beneficiary? There's always this kind of colonial language. And of late, I'll discuss this at the end, the word partner is starting to be used more. There's also a language of beneficiary voice, which somehow sounds like, well, the people are rising up and want to speak. But the very exchange of money contains a moral foundation to it. All right, so we're going to use a couple of ideas to make sense of this transformation in philanthropy over time. So the first, maybe not surprisingly, is this idea of transposition that John Paget and I have worked so much with. And the way to think of transposition, we actually quite brazenly borrowed it from Stuart Kaufman, a colleague at Santa Fe. It's a process where practices are drawn from the adjacent possible. It's a way in which the present can reconfigure itself, and it becomes common in domains where there's cross-traffic and ongoing conversations. So what elite philanthropists do is draw on their business practices and have them influence or shape their means of redistributing their wealth. They have a kind of fixed idea, an idée fixe, how you earn your wealth conditions how you give it away. So we would call that cognitive transposition, using the tools, the rules of thumb in one domain in a different domain. But they also impose on recipients particular practices. Nonprofits today have to act like startups, incubators, produce metrics, talk about scaling. Scaling is rampant. I'm teaching a course at the moment with Patricia Bromley that has GSB, law, public policy, joint degree students. They all want to go out in the world and run social enterprises. Their enthusiasm is considerable. And their mantra is scaling. How do we get them big? And Aaron and I want to think of this as a kind of moral transposition. That is, it's not just you give money, but your expectations of what people do with that money get baked into the transfer of money. And then the other idea we have is one called braiding. And braiding is the process by which old ideas and new ideas become connected. And we've searched for a visual of this, and maybe this rope is probably the best way we can do it. And if you look with a presentist eye, what people are doing looks new. But if you look at it from the past, you can see the threads of the past that get woven into the present. And we're going to try and show you how that process works. Okay. So let me give you an illustration with the use of braiding. And then I'll spend a little time going through it. So in the early days of the Gilded Age and the early origins of scientific charity, the focus was on, we need an investigation. We have to have an examination of what the social problem is and try to find its root cause, and then we understand it. As outrage over elite influence developed, and some tools of program evaluation developed as well, you began to see the same kind of investigation turn into a demonstration. So you ran a trial program. It wasn't quite a randomized clinical trial, but you ran a program to see if the program had an effect on the topic being investigated. And then with the new Gilded Age venture capital, along with a decline in government, let me back up, these demonstrations, if successful during their era, the idea was that would be turned over to government to scale up. Okay, government would step in and take the successful ones. But the persistence since the 1970s, decline in faith in government, the new Gilded Age venture capital model now sees this not as a demonstration, but an investment in which, whether it's a daycare center, a way of delivering medicines to the third world, a new high school, a charter movement, they're supposed to scale on their own independently of the state. And so you can see the weaving of past practices into the present, but with each along the way change in the process. Okay. So we think of philanthropy not as just generosity, but it's signposts that mark our understanding of democracy, wealth, and very much it tells us about the kind of society we have become. So the early era we call from retail to wholesale philanthropy. This is the first era, one of the great industrialists and robber barons. We should all smile. We are the beneficiaries of these guys sitting at Cornell University. Me sitting here in my office at Stanford. This was money that came from the industrious elite, given to the masses. And it took a lot of work to make that transfer happen. The legal status of charitable organizations was deeply contested. We talk at some length about how the U.S. Senate refused to create a charter for Rockefeller, for the Rockefeller Foundation. It had to become a New York State foundation. And most giving in this early era was through fraternal activities in churches. But what the first generation of philanthropists wanted to do was switch from charity to science. And so they used their personal advisors, a man named Gates, who was Rockefeller's. They hired museum directors and gardens, directors of botanical gardens. Personal ties were very important. But the pressure here was to move charity from compassionate to dispassionate. John Moore's work on this period about the moral transformation here is, sadly I should say was, John is no longer with us, absolutely spot on in capturing this kind of transformation. And there was a lot of critique of it because, as you saw with Pup Magazine, it was characterized as a new American aristocracy. But the scientific nature of it was really quite clear in the progressive era. You know, on the left is the handouts to impoverished immigrants. On the right is a design for Jane Addams' Hull House. And you can't see it well, but it's an extraordinary document assigning people to stations based on their ethnicity and country of origin and their specific social problem. And here, you know, you could deal with social problems without sentimentality and try to do it in a systematic way. And so a lineup of that is really quite staggering. Carnegie was vilified for his double role. You know, he paid very low wages, and yet in turn he gave vast sums. And he was very clear that giving higher wages would be a mistake. Paying people more, they would just waste it on drink, and it would not serve the betterment of mankind. Trifling sums given to each every week or month would be frittered away, in which things would pertain to the body and not to the spirit, upon richer food and drink, better clothing, more extravagant living, which are beneficial neither to the rich nor poor. So what he wanted were libraries and universities. We can't find any evidence that he set foot in these libraries or universities, but that was, you know, his sense that man does not live by bread alone. One challenge for these early billionaires, was they couldn't give the money away fast enough. There's in one of the biographies of Rockefeller, there's a long discussion about the number of people asking him for money and the amount of letters he received, and how unhappy his life was, where he was trying to give his money away, but there were so many requests he didn't know what to do with them all. So, smart man, I'm going to build an organization. And that's when he set about to organize philanthropy and to set up foundations. And typically the early foundations were ones in which the wives and sons took over. The family trusts became general purpose foundations. There were at the time some community foundations. There's some fascinating examples of counter foundations. I won't go into them today, but the Rosewall Fund is one of the ones discussed most, where Sears Roebuck money, and Julian Rosewall didn't want the money and then told he had to take it. He decided he would use it. He said, I'm a communist. I'm going to use all the money to support small Black colleges in the South and the NAACP. He went on to spend money in ways that his family were not particularly happy with. But imagery here is of the early days of scientific philanthropy. Okay, so family trusts got made into general purpose foundations. They had small staff. They relied very heavily on experts and social scientists. You can think of organizations that have been very important to many of us, like the Social Science Research Council, as an example during this period. Back in the 1920s, the council was created, and they convinced Charles Merriman to move from University of Chicago to New York to create something called the SSRC, which today is on the verge of its 100th anniversary. These new entities relied a lot on surveys, and they had some of the earliest ideas about demonstration projects. And much of contemporary social science finds its origins from this period. In sociology, Howard is down there in North Carolina. Howard Odom, of course, and his surveys. They were funded during this era by the SSRC and some of this early philanthropic money. There was a lot of legislative challenge and critique to these organizations, and there was also a sense that they were an in-run around government, and so many questions about them. The challenges, I'm probably downplaying this, what we do in the work is try to figure what is the basis of the challenges that then undercut the legitimacy of the vision in each era. Typically we date these eras by House or Senate investigations and public outcry over the ways in which foundation money is being spent. So just to give you an idea of the routines, this is a terrific one. Here's a Carnegie Library. So there was an RFP for Carnegie Library grants, and Mr. Bertram would send a questionnaire to the city, its size, number of books, how many what tax revenues would be used to support the library, the availability of land for the construction, how much money has been collected thus far, send the design of the library, and if a grant was offered, and remember, they ended up funding, what's the number, Aaron? More than 26 or 2,700 libraries in the United States, and many more around the world. But each city had to go through this process. And then the city would have to say that it would commit 10% of the grant amount annually to continue. And so the process of applying, began looking a lot like submitting a grant. If you're trying to do a program project at a university and you have to say how much your university supports it and the like. So this model of the library grant application became kind of ubiquitous across foundations. But a lot of challenges came underway. In the early 50s, the Cox Committee and the Reese Committee began charging that foundations tend to support only work that had a leftist tinge to it. The foundations got caught up in the McCarthy era. And so there's much more indictment of the kinds of activities of foundations. The money that flowed in began to expand. We started getting automotive wealth, the Ford Foundation, began to get healthcare, Johnson & Johnson, big pharma money, Lilly. And again, the idea was that they would explore new ways of solving social problems and then turn it over when successful to the government. You began to see all kinds of field building activities take place, Council on Foundations, a Foundation Center Library, foundation committees. In the language of DiMaggio and Powell, you really do see a field construction here in which there's connections among people move between foundations. Staffs grow and become much more prominent. There becomes a revolving door of people leaving the industries that fund the philanthropy and then moving into philanthropy, people moving from government jobs to philanthropy. sometimes distant heirs, but there's an interesting piece, we'll pick it up in the next year, of when I think it's, I'm blanking on which Ford it was, Edsel Ford, yeah, leaves the Ford Foundation in protest over how the money is being spent. But there's much more an interest now on value neutral science, coalition building between foundations and governments. The personal hand of donors starts to recede. And you might argue, if you were a career person, someone like Diane Burton, that what you're seeing here is the professionalization of a career. The earlier era was entrepreneurial. Now these are the managers of foundations, and there's finally a career for the management of foundation. Much of the work is around urban problems and around civil rights. But in the late 60s, a Texas populist, it'd be really fascinating to try to take this guy, Wright Patman, and figure out what the hell he is today. You know, he's kind of, I don't know if this is fair, a Ted Cruz on the left. He was a Democrat. He was deeply opposed to wealth and thought that philanthropy was a tax dodge and it should not be permitted. The wealthy should be taxed. And maybe Huey Long is closer as imagery of Patman. But anyway, Patman invade against foundations for years. He finally got a committee that allowed him to do investigations. And he actually proposed really dramatic changes in foundations. If they'd gone through, we would have a different world today. So the original idea that he proposed is that foundations could not exist in perpetuity. I think he wanted either a 25 or a 40-year limit on them. Some of that discussion comes back today. He also wanted a spend out annually of 10%. Eventually, there was a Tax Reform Act of 1969 in which some of the sharp edges of Patman's demands were sanded off, and we got the familiar 5% that we have today. But foundations now started becoming much more professional things. This is a fabulous picture. Aaron found it. It's just a crack up. Here's McGeorge Bundy. Of course, he's come from working in the White House, and he will go back. He's now head of Ford. You can see him there with his feet up on his coffee table. And they write a mission statement. And so foundations have to legitimate themselves in the public eye. And the way they do it is by saying, we fund grants for experimental demonstrations and development programs designed to achieve advances, you know, that serve the public welfare. And so this is the new kind of imagery. The image of robber barons has been cleansed. I don't know if purified is the right word, but it's certainly blended into a much more corporate style. I remember back when Paul, back when we were assistant professors, Mike Useem saying to us, you know, these now are the liberal wing of the ruling class, was the way Useem characterized foundations at that time. And certainly this picture of Bundy is a fantastic one. But this is Patman, and he doesn't stop. He says, you know, the benefits of foundations don't outweigh their abuses. You know, philanthropy is a noble instinct, but it's a way for the rich to get away from paying taxes and use the money for their personal interests. And so his critique, I think, is one that, nevertheless, even though he didn't win this tax reform, the kinds of questions he raised have continued to loom large. This next era changes a good bit. The sources of wealth change, and this is probably one of the most important shifts. More money from Wall Street, from finance, but particularly we get Hewlett and Packard, the beginning of tech money coming in. And you see foundations much more involved in advocacy on the left and on the right, okay? So that the vision now is that the money should contest, should challenge government and public opinion, that you're making investments in political developments of the future. So think of the Olin Foundation, its role in the law and economics movement. And you see foundations themselves beginning to build ideological coalitions. The Philanthropy Roundtable becomes a venue for the more conservative foundations. The staffing continues to be professional, but it shifts. Many more people from political parties and just a huge influx of ABDs. Graduate students will recognize that. Anything but dissertation, all but dissertation, moving into universities. And now, instead of value-free science, you begin to see value-tilted science, as well as competitive review processes that didn't exist before. And the themes are much more ideological. The charter school movement, school vouchers, things like that gets going. And so you start asking yourself, has philanthropy become a handbrake on government, or is it a passing gear to move past what government is doing and alter its trajectory? And lots of ways in which American society is remade by money during this era. A good example from someone you may know, Orville Brim, has this piece on the future of foundations in 1972 that begins to create standards of program evaluation. How it is that you assess the success or failure of grants. Trying to measure whether or not your grants have had an impact becomes a big issue. Figuring out how you choose between different program areas within foundations. You know, beginning to decide, what does your portfolio of gifts look like? And you know, trying to force foundations to determine whether a program actually achieves its goals. And so you see the early seeds of what later becomes strategic philanthropy. Robert Wood Johnson is, perhaps because they come from the medical side, they argued very early on that foundations must be more transparent and provide data on what they're doing and share that. So they're one of the first to issue an annual report that makes clear who they fund. And one of their early goals, a really fascinating one, was to do something about ambulatory medical care. We take for granted today that, you know, my neighbor, sadly I'm on a neighborhood, it's a very eminent neighborhood in the faculty ghetto. There are 3 Nobel laureates on our street, but they're in their 80s and 90s, and several have passed away, and the ambulance comes pretty regularly. But you know, the fact that you can dial them and they're there is something that didn't always happen. So can you imagine back in 1973, the availability of 911 was only 11% in the United States. And so RWJF hired RAND to help them with a project to roll out 911, link it to police and fire departments in a very short period of time, transform its availability, grow the number of emergency medical techs and paramedics, adding radios to ambulances. You know, there's an implementation that, at least on the surface, you would say a transformation happened, okay? But they're now asking themselves, does this transformation in terms of how many health providers there were actually have a medical impact? Does it save lives more? So you begin to see this sort of, you know, attempt at rigorous assessment of whether or not the money that was given actually gets used for the purposes that were intended. We move to 2000. We date 2000 with, it's hard to believe, that is the kind of official year for the creation of the Gates Foundation. The family foundation that was run by Gates's father began in the mid-90s, but the actual Gates Foundation starting point is roughly 2000. And now philanthropy has, to a very considerable extent, moved from the Northeast to the West Coast. And the West Coast becomes the epicenter of philanthropy. And now you see a completely different vision. It is this move fast and break things. Money disrupts. Aaron actually wants to say dynamites the tracks of society. The Weber image of track laying, blowing up the tracks, building new ones. And it's not clear where the new ones are supposed to go in parallel, or charter schools or private schools, and school vouchers supposed to exist in parallel with public schools, or are they supposed to supplant them? The model becomes much more of a policy patron, in which Gates and Pew, take on a role as almost cabinet level branches of government, but nevertheless private. Gates, some argue is the Secretary of Public Health for the world, and tried to be a failed Secretary of Education for the US. So there's much more interest in how do we shape policy. There are lots of new models. Many of the foundations have now shifted to be LLCs. They can do different things as LLCs. They can pay much higher salaries. They can be much less transparent. They can invest in startups, and most notably, they can contribute to political causes. The staffing is very different now. It's elite couples. A good example locally is Chan Zuckerberg. They hire computer scientists from PhD programs here at Stanford in great numbers, more than 300 in the past couple of years, pay them wages comparable to the private sector. And the idea is that they work very hard to give away their fortunes. It's become a job not just for computer scientists, but there's a lot of political science PhDs who've moved in. And so area experts, almost departments their practices are deeply strange because they talk about transparency, but the organizations themselves are incredibly secretive. Gates demands that if they give money to researchers, that the researchers have to share their data, have open publication of everything. But the Gates Foundation by itself actually only has 3 board members, and they're all family members. And there's much less of this applying for money that there was in the earlier era. Now it's you get tapped and pick for money. And when money is given, the focus is on RCTs, evidence-based focus, very short time horizon. And if you look at Gates' proposal process, what do they call it? How do we make investments? Within each strategy, we collaborate with grantee and partner organizations. It's a 4-phase model. You develop the concept, pre-proposal, investment development, management, and close. Straight from the venture capital world. This is not the earlier world of applying for grants and having a competitive analysis process. You get tapped to co-develop something, and how it develops will depend on their work with you and their decisions about it. Okay, this investment approach has kind of taken over philanthropy in the first 20 years of this century. And many of you will know these organizations. And if you go through the Giving Pledge, Aaron has done a text analysis of all the signees on the Giving Pledge, and the most common terms are these 5. Impact, scaling, innovation. So it is entirely the language now of the venture capital world. And what makes this possible? You see this declining trust in government and the idea that private funding can now provide an alternative to state activity. And the mindset is, in running a company, You look for great leaders and invest in them. So you no longer invest in organizations or programs, but you invest in people. And the mantra of social entrepreneurs becomes important. But this moment of Mark here giving the money to a city, Newark, where he'd never been, that seemed like such a major move, turned out to be an abject failure in Newark. And several things have kind of come out of that, which begin to suggest maybe we're at the stage of a new wave of this. But if I take this back to our original, think of the moral side. Early on, there was a strong emphasis on self-sufficiency. And there's this emphasis on rigorous evaluation. Here, there's the no metrics, no money. You can see the ideology that gets baked into the different set of processes. The question is whether there's suddenly new challenges to this, moving fast and breaking things. It's interesting that executives from Facebook, Google, and Twitter were brought before Congress just as Rockefeller, Carnegie, Stanford were brought before Congress. But I think more striking is the cultural shift. Recall just 2 years ago, Bezos made an announcement that he was going to donate $2 billion to fight homelessness. And many people responded, shouldn't we be thinking about having a society where no one can ever become as rich as he is? And I think that transformation and the glorification of philanthropy is well underway. And so Aaron and I wonder if we have a new turn. It's begun in the past year. COVID has certainly sped it up. It's prompted by a reckoning of systemic racism, police murders, the inequities that the pandemic has brought. There's a backlash against this metrics and outcomes movement, as my colleague Rob Reich says, whose measures, who gets to choose the metrics. We don't know if this is a blip, a wave, or is it the beginning of something new. But what you see in a very interesting way is the sources of wealth now are indirect. They're not the founders of tech companies, but the money comes from tech. The new faces are women. They're also at established foundations, people of color who are finding new purposes for old money. The vision now is called trust-based philanthropy. You pick the partner, you put the money on the table, on the transom, and let them do their thing. The past few months, Mackenzie Scott has been probably the most direct, throwing shade on Jeff Bezos by her giving away, I think just this year alone, she's given nearly $5 billion. And nobody applied for it. She picked the beneficiaries and then gave them the money. Interestingly, that to me has a funny kind of matriarchal feature to it, but the money is given without strings and much less fanfare. And the money is multi-year operating gifts. And so the possibility of transformation is underway again. So what's the use of doing this? Aaron and I have spent an enormous amount of time. It's been fun trying to read through the history of philanthropy. And I think what we're trying to understand are things that contribute to organizational theory and economic sociology in some particular ways. We're really struck by how much organizational routines and practices leave their imprint on successive generations, that as you move from one era to another, the practices from one imbue what's possible in the next. And even as new forms of wealth create new organizational models, those get braided with the older practices. And then different generations pick up some of these ideas, all right? If we move in the world of kind of policy, we want to understand how such a small number of people can have such extraordinary influence on American society and what the nature of that influence is. We live in a new Gilded Age. that philanthropy claims it wants to mitigate, but maybe it exacerbates inequality. And we also want to point out all kinds of ways in which small amounts of money, rather than giant gifts that prove to be acts of ego, have had a consequence. We began by saying there was, a lot of opposition to philanthropy, and so it was seen as blood money, as dirty money, and today there's this shift in which we accept the legitimacy of philanthropy even as we criticize it, and to us that's a really dramatic change in vision. I'll end with this. We like this a lot because on the right, it's Governor Christie, Senator Booker, Zuckerberg, Oprah. This was the $100 million gift to Newark, money down the drain. On the left is Big Bird. That was a $10 million gift to the Children's TV Workshop. And that $10 million gift went on to create Sesame Street, public broadcasting's biggest success, and something that exists until today. And the contrast between the money that attached to these big egos and the small grants that end up making a huge difference is something we want to emphasize and explore. So I'll stop there. I hope I haven't gone too long. Nobody, as I can tell, has been screaming and yelling. I hope that's not something that I did wrong. And I'll stop sharing my screen, and that way I can see all of you. There you go. Okay. Aaron, you get to answer questions.
Great.
No, I'm teasing. We can do it together.
Sure.
I have a question. If we're hi, Woody. So this was great. I learned so much. Thank you. My question is about which you may not be surprised by, is about the role of developments in the legal domain over this time period. So both how they might figure into this transformation in the nonprofit sector, but also how the nonprofit sector might shape the legal domain in turn. So both in terms of regulations that might directly apply to foundations and giving, but also sort of more tangential laws and policies. So I'm thinking specifically about the rise of the welfare state, and also welfare state retrenchment. So how did the actions happening in these two different domains relate and inform each other?
So I could answer that, and I could almost answer that too much in ways that will go in so many different directions. So I'll kind of just give you some impressionistic thoughts and we can discuss. So the first thought when you said legal domain, and I think this is something Woody neglected to mention, is in that shift from the kind of 1960s era to 1970s era, yes, there were new sources of money, but a lot of what happened in that era was a pretty sharp rebuke of stuff that was going on before it. Mm-hmm. And in that sharp rebuke, it was basically to create a sort of conservative counterintelligentsia to what like the Ford Foundation had created as a naively apolitical, somewhat technocratic, vaguely progressive, Lyndon B. Johnson supporting, initiative. And out of that came, I'm sure the story is well known now, but like, the law and economics movement. And from that, we have, Federalist Society. We have all sorts of efforts to basically like change the, how we practice and think about laws in this country. And, the effect being our current Supreme Court in the long run. So that's one aspect of the legal here. Another thing I heard in your question is a much more recent thing. Around the turn of the current century, there was, a whole, there was a bunch of scandals going on that were being really well publicized in the nonprofit sector. And this coincided with a time when there's more of a kind of business language and discourse coming into the nonprofit sector as well via, Gates style philanthropy. It's now investment. And the coincidence of this, like, we have to regulate the rogues, and this business thing led to a whole slate of regulation, both in a legal sense. There's now more audits. There's been changes in what the IRS demands, et cetera, et cetera. Not that they can actually afford to do any of this stuff, but there's changes in what they demand, and there's changes at the state level in nonprofit laws and standards and whatnot. But there's also more of a regulatory development at the foundation level, talking about impact and whatnot. And what's been interesting to see in how this kind of folds back on how nonprofits are regulated is nonprofits have responded to this stuff by saying, sure, we love accountability too, because for the most part, turns out people aren't all scamming, everyone. And they've created a lot of their own metrics, and they've done a lot of stuff that is far and beyond what they're ever being asked by the state to do. I'm kind of curious going forward if that means, and we're seeing some inklings of this now, that the regulators adapt a bit and say, gee, we can't just stamp this, uniform standard onto the incredibly diverse nonprofit sector. We have to have a much more nuanced and variable set of standards that are more responsive to the specific work these organizations are doing. So I think that's going to fold back onto the regulatory aspect and shape even how nonprofits are regulated. So there's kind of a dance back and forth between regulators, foundations that have a kind of regulatory power, and then the nonprofit organizations themselves. And in many ways, the little guys who are, having to implement a lot of the stuff that's being thrust upon them.
If we abstract from that, I love the language here. You used fold back and dance. And if we did better, we would take Celine's question and think about our idea of braiding specifically on the legal side, okay? And so foundations and philanthropy as being regulated at different times, okay? And, I emphasize Wright Patman, I could have done more in 73, in which the state attempts to organize philanthropy. But philanthropy is, the dance is constantly trying to organize itself, and it can engage in self-regulation. It can engage in different kinds of transparency. The Robert Wood Johnson annual report is an effort at legal autonomy by saying, look at what we're doing. Okay, so that's really important. But at the same time, this movement of philanthropy is trying to alter the laws themselves. Mm-hmm. Well, 2 members of our Supreme Court are the result of the Federalist Society.
I think it's 6.
It's 6.
It's
dump off the 4th floor here.
Don't think about it though.
Yeah. Okay. So that gives you an idea of how the legal system itself becomes deeply embedded in the efforts of philanthropy. Michael, I see you've got a hand up.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So yes, Woody, Aaron, thank you very much for a really interesting tour, comparative analysis of the changes over time and in the mission and practices and organization of philanthropy. And I learned a lot from this, but I wonder if it would not also be useful to do a cross-national or cross-social comparison, particularly with Sweden, because Sweden has historically eschewed big philanthropy, which they understandably see as being a competitor to government. But the interesting thing is that recently the Swedes are now embracing this the tech version of philanthropy. So they kind of skipped to the chase instead of going through all the steps that you traced out today. Sweden just seems to have just leaped over the whole thing and gone right to the tech-oriented vision of philanthropy, and it's growing in Sweden. And I'm wondering if do you think this proves? I could see this as sort of proving one of 2 possible theories about why this is happening. One, it would be that, well, capitalism always wins out in the end. So social democracy only can hold out for so long. And now the 1% are going to replace social democracy with a big chunk of philanthropic decision-making for the social welfare. But the other possible explanation is that, well, maybe this is what they should do, and that that government is too much of a monopoly, and that shifting a big chunk of the support and decision making for protecting us from ignorance and poverty and whatnot, and for enhancing social welfare, we should shift that to the private sector, if you will, to the philanthropic sector, because they can experiment better. They can run multiple Petri dishes to see what works and what doesn't, and it's just a better model than the social democratic model. So which do you think it might be? Do you think it's that is the Sweden story cause for a concern that it means that there's just social democracy is doomed to being finally pushed out by the philanthropic alternative? Or is this evidence that maybe this is a better model than social democracy?
Great question. I'm somewhat less familiar with Sweden than, say, China, where we know philanthropy in China is flourishing, and it's a very similar story. It's tech-driven money. Huawei, Tencent are big corporate philanthropists. Most elite billionaires in China have their personal philanthropies. And so, even in the belly of an autocratic communist state, you see the growth of tech philanthropy. In Scandinavia, you do see this growth. And I think there are sort of three kinds of questions to think about. You nailed two of them well. Like, one, can we think of these as laboratories of experimentation? If you're going to find a justification for 1% philanthropy, I think the laboratory of experimentation is probably the best case you can make, right? That they can try out things that the state can't try out. You might want to be careful about who you inflict that trying out on and think about inequities in doing it, but that would certainly be one kind of argument. But in countries like Sweden, they're so dependent upon high quality public services because people pay such considerable taxes for those services. You worry about, does this experimentation undercut? And so by jumping all those phases, you get some very interesting challenges. So we've been looking, Aaron and I have a project called the Civic Life of Cities, where we're studying civil society in 7 cities around the world. Unfortunately, our only old world city is Vienna. Most of our cities are in Asia and the US. They're Taipei, Shenzhen, Seattle, San Francisco, Sydney, Singapore, all places where new wealth money is pouring in. And it's a really interesting process, Michael. In Shenzhen, even though it's an autocratic place, it nevertheless is such a tech center that it has the largest nonprofit sector in China. And some of that is because of the large migrant population in the city, where the official population is half what the actual number of people who live there. And so philanthropy provides the services for that other half. And we've had executive directors willing to talk with us, but often they stress, let's talk while we're walking, let's talk in my car, let's talk, they don't talk in the office so often. And there's a sense that in that setting, the state is nevertheless ever present, all right? In the Scandinavian sense, the state is providing some cover and willingness for this kind of experimentation. And it would be really important to look and see who does this money go to and who benefits from it. But I'm really struck by it in your question. What does it mean to skip eras and just start with one era? And what does that tell us? So thank you.
If I may too, I'm really struck by that question as well, and I know next to nothing about Sweden's political scene. But you provided kind of two options, like capitalism always wins, or the kind of efficiency of the tech philanthropy. And I kind of wonder if it actually is either. approach I would take there is just by looking at the malleability of political values within Sweden and seeing how they change. In a somewhat related project right now, I'm looking at how a similar thing, but in the US, of how US government, which had long abhorred strong executives and was terrified of centralized power, ended up becoming a place that allocated a lot more power to the hands of the centralized executive, and celebrated that. And that's basically now our political system. How did that become possible? And the line of argument that I'm pursuing there is that it's basically the meaning of what it meant to do democracy changed. And in large part, it's because government was recast as just an organization that was subject to the rules of efficiency and hierarchy. And if it's going to be an organization, you have to organize it that way. So I would wonder in the Swedish case if there has been some kind of external rethinking of what it means to have a government and what it's supposed to be doing. So changing expectations.
Hi, can I ask a question, please? Yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. And I have two questions actually. So one is a very kind of detailed one, and second is like a general methodological question. So to begin with the detailed questions, I was very interested in the idea of transpositions, that like the prevalent institutional logics of the business fields gets transposed into nonprofits, and the way they run their business actually affects their the way philanthropy is run. And I was a bit curious about what happened in the current two eras, and you emphasized the institutional logics of how venture capitals and tech economies are run, but I also think that there could be influences of financialization of the economy. For example, I think it was Emily Barman and Nicholas Guillot who talked about how the concept of SROI, social return on investment, was actually proposed by Roberts Foundation, which was Roberts, who it was part of KKR, Colbert, Kravitz, Roberts, and they kind of try to actually exert their influence through adopting this SROI framework, and they shape the behaviors, organizational behaviors of social enterprises and nonprofits by this disciplinary mechanisms of SROI. So how do you see any connection in the current era of this financialization of the economy in transposing its practice to nonprofits? And how does it connect to how venture capitalists, I think I see kind of venture capitalists are also adopting this framework of SROI. So I don't think there's a conflict between the two. So how do you see the interaction between these two forces coming in to shape the institutional logics of these nonprofits nowadays? That's my first question.
Do you want to throw the second question at us too?
Yeah. So second question is about a methodological question. So in trying to create connection between the institutional logics of these business fields and nonprofits in certain areas, and trying to create critical junctures that I think you have claimed 5. There's 5 critical junctures. How do you establish kind of robustly the causal linkage is in this? Because I mean, I get that this paper is a very long project, so it has a very long historical roots, and by reading these narratives, it's very easy to see that there's a transition. But if you kind of try to, in microscopic lenses, I think it'd be really hard to create causal linkages. and claim that there's a causal linkage between the two. So how do you kind of show kind of in objective manner, like that there's a kind of trend, there was a transposition actually? Yeah.
So I could take that question first, I guess. In some ways, it's really easy. If you go through the archives of these foundations, they say it, some of them say it explicitly, like this is just how we run things. You know, that's very apparent at the Rockefeller Archive Center, where they maintain just beautiful archives, and you see it in a lot of the correspondence, where it's just clear that some things they're saying this is how we did it here, this is how we're going to do it here. And other times just because it's unthinkable to do anything else to them. This is that French phrase that I can never for the life of me pronounce, but the idea fixe or something like that. You know, and that's very present. Now, of course, the challenge with that is, I mean, that's kind of a direct causal, like this is what they're doing, and it's clear in what they say they're doing, it's clear what they actually do. But finding a bigger pattern of that presents a pretty large challenge for us, because archives are only so many. It takes you know, many days, weeks, months, and a lot of back pain and a lot of coffee to flip through them. And so one thing that Woody and I are in the, you know, thinking about doing and have had some early stirrings on doing is creating a massive database of foundation annual reports, basically over the period we're looking at here. And the aim there is that if we can collect a sufficient number of these, we can actually start looking at like linguistic, you know, things going on here, where it's the language they're using in one field, it represents the language that they're using in another field. It does represent a connection. Now, of course, you could always say like, sure, that's how they talk about it, but what are they actually doing? And that'd be the next step. But that's how we're trying to approach that. This paper represents an early effort to see that connection at all. The next step is trying to better document the patterns. When is it strongest? When is it not? What fields seem to ascend? What don't? And that would be a really cool thing for us to do.
And then, Aaron, we should answer the first question too.
Oh yeah.
Let me give a slightly different take, particularly for grad students thinking about projects like this. So I've had the wonderful good fortune of having a visiting position in the past couple of years at the University of Cambridge. And Cambridge is full of these extraordinary museums. And one of the most remarkable ones is the Geology Museum. And you walk through that museum, and first of all, you see the way they've laid it out, the history of how geology emerged as a science. You know, that in the 1800s, it was amateurs collecting bones and selling things. And then, you know, we go through all these famous eras of time. They're named after, you see how much it's baked into British colonialism. They're named after, you know, places in England. But as you go in that museum and you go through each era, what they say is, when does a new species or a new thing appear at that time? And then the next year is, when does another species? That doesn't mean it wipes out the one before, it gets layered on top of that, but it's the first appearance of that. And so what we did for our periodization, it's Aaron and Woody's periodization, but it's, you know, driven, the cut points were political contestation, Senate committees saying it can't be done this way anymore, the rules have to change, or the first emergence of something new. Okay, and so Gates, no metrics, no money, kind of dates it to now. Could someone else go through and come up with a different periodization? Possibly. And I think that links nicely to your first question. We're, you know, for better or for worse, out here in California. So, you know, and Mark Zuckerberg intrudes on my favorite Mexican restaurant all the time, and I'm sitting there drinking a margarita. He comes in and sits down, so I have to see his, you know, mug. In fact, the day Aaron and I finished this paper, my wife and I went to dinner, and lo and behold, who sat at the table next to us in this cheap little Mexican joint was Mark and Priscilla. We ordered the exact same thing. He left a $100 tip, I didn't. So, you know, I'm sure there's a color that we've given that's West Coast. this moving fast and breaking things. I think a richer analysis that we ought to do is the way in which private equity money and some parts of Wall Street interlaced with the venture capital model. And so I think what you're suggesting, and maybe Emily Barman's work is excellent on this, how the metrics of evaluation might have been drawn from finance. So that's Michael's the 1% rules, but the betting on individuals, let's give money to people and treat them like a startup. But that focus is very much the West Coast. And so there's a hybridization of the two that I think is quite interesting.
Plus the heavy-handedness of venture capital sitting on the board, you kind of see that practice carried into nonprofits as well. Yeah. We're going to tell you a little more what we want you to do.
I think Paul's hand beat mine. Why don't you go first? You're muted.
We can't hear you.
Ollie, you're muted.
Zoom is so weird because you look at the person on the screen, but the person themselves, actually the constellation of little squares is completely different. So you were looking over to your left and I'm way on your right. So I was looking for a different Paul on your left. Anyway, this is really a masterful summary and great to hear how this is sort of culminated. I have two questions. One is just kind of a clarification information question, and then the other one is more of an analytic question. So you talk about how the reaction to the sort of break things model seems to be giving lots of money to organizations and letting them use it for operating support and basically becoming patrons of the organization, which is kind of where we came in, right? I mean, that was, so are they returning to the old Ford Rockefeller model of the 1950s and 60s, or is this a different way of doing that? So that's kind of the information question. Then the other question is, it's going to sound skeptical, but I'm really trying to draw you out on the reasons why it probably isn't going to play out this way again. When the you know, if you think of the Ford Foundation, when it started, it was kind of conservative and then it became liberal. The Pew Endowment started as a right-wing foundation and then got kind of domesticated. The MacArthur Foundation started out with Paul Harvey on the board and, you know, set a record, I think, for getting domesticated and becoming a mainstream and eventually a liberal foundation. So I can think of a number of reasons why that is unlikely to happen again and why these sort of brash new actors, but what would you say to somebody who said, well, you always get these, you know, brash people, young people coming in with new money, starting foundations, and then as soon as they retire, the foundation professionals come in and change it. So what would you say to somebody who made that argument?
I think that's broadly correct that you see this kind of organizational aging process. With the three you mentioned, Ford, Pew, and MacArthur, there's a very explicit generational shift, right? Mm-hmm. And that also comes along with the kind of bureaucratization of the foundation itself and the growth of professionals and whatnot. I don't see a reason necessarily that wouldn't play out with our current kind of cadre of super rich people. I think the process will play out over a longer time though, because these people are so young, right? Like Zuckerberg is like only a couple of years my senior, and I'm like, I never have a chance to have this influence, but he can have this influence for, the next 60 years, right? And so I just see the process as like really blown up and expanded as opposed to end of life giving. The other shift that's, I think, really remarkable is we are seeing a return to some earlier era giving while living type discourse. And, that's coming back. Like if you look through the giving letters and the current models of the people who are really occupying headlines in philanthropy, they're saying things like, we want to give while we can still see what our gifts do. And, we have yet to really see if that happens, and we have plenty of time to see if it happens, but there's at least that claim. And so I wonder if there's even the opportunity for the generational shift now, as opposed to in the past, where we see oil money become pro-environment money and things like that.
Could I riff just for a second and come to your first, Paul? I totally agree with your analysis of older foundations. And in fact, in this long presentation, you couldn't do everything, but part of our Stinchcomian theme in the chapter is how much eras, have a subsequent influence. And this era of foundation staff, taking over from the original donors is a hugely important imprint. I think Aaron picked up some of the differences today, but I'd add two things to it. Many of the entities being created today are built with something called an exit strategy, just as you have with startups. And there you get a very interesting conundrum about, can they give the money away fast enough? All right, so the Gates couples have said all money from their foundation will be dispersed within 25 years of their death. Others say within 10 years of their death. Others commit to within their lifetime. So let's take Mackenzie Scott with her $5-point-something billion gifts in the past couple of months. Really extraordinary, on some dimensions, transforming historically Black colleges, the likes of which they've never had before in terms of gifts. In fact, I think at Howard, the president said he wouldn't take the call. He thought it was a crank call. And then he thought it was a crazy person. And then it's like, really? You're giving us, okay. So to me, that sounds like a matriarchy that looks different than the older patriarchy, okay? So there is a difference there. But for all her generosity, analysts have said she actually has earned more during the pandemic in her Amazon stock than she gave away. So even wanting to give all the money away, the amount of money coming in is so considerable. So that's back to Rockefeller's problem in the 19-teens, where the money is coming in, and he simply doesn't know, and he has to create an organization to try to do it. But there is some sense, as I was writing this up, this table last night of the last era, which I didn't get done in time to share with you, Aaron, I apologize. Matriarchy kept appearing in my mind, like a new version, so that's our braiding, a new twist on an old thing. So, yeah. Diane.
Yeah, so I've been doing some work on impact investing, which kind of nicely dovetails with what you're talking about. And the piece that strikes me that I think there's a couple pieces, but this idea that these new foundations have a new legal form, and that legal form is not a nonprofit legal form. It feels really important to me, because there are, in fact, some new tech monies doing foundation nonprofit things, but there are lots that are doing these private kind of corporate LLC entities. And at least in my read of what's happening with impact investing, more money is going into the for-profit vehicles than into the nonprofit vehicles. And so that feels like a very different change about how we think about, what's going to happen to this charitable sector or the nonprofit sector. I'm just curious about your thoughts of this mixing of the private and the nonprofit, or the blurring of the boundaries.
So our center at Stanford has an advisory board that is full of the uber rich that are doing these things. And at the last meeting, I wish I could have followed 3 women into the women's room. This is a sign of the change, because I could hear them through the walls talking about the advantages of an LLC. And so, one of them was telling the other, and a few months later, the Arnolds switched from the Arnold Foundation to Arnold Ventures. And I'm sure some of the conversation there was part of it. I think there's just this growing movement, cachet that gets started. the Omidyars began it. That was the first one. Then Laurene Powell Jobs. And then it's spread in, I don't want to say like wildfire, but in considerable number. We can't get inside them very easy, the way you can get inside foundations in terms of access. But you do notice the kinds of people who get hired to work there, and they have to sign documents about what they can talk about and things like that. And there's, to the earlier question, there's much more sense of applying private sector metrics to what's being done, and relying on big data as a tool to doing these things. So yeah, I think this form is going to grow. Whether it'll supplant foundations, I don't know, but it's certainly in terms of the amount of money that's being put into it, it's pretty extraordinary.
I also wonder if it's kind of a fascinating moment where our very definition of charity is kind of up for grabs, because for so long we've relied on these kind of arbitrary social construction, legal codifications of what we do and do not count as charity. And if you look back to, like, old Pennsylvania law where this distinction first comes out, it's like ice skating rinks and clubs and like horse trotting organizations. And it's like, that's charitable, right? But at some point you can also say, like, maybe giving my money to, a for-profit business that, makes some product, like, that is itself charity, right? Maybe giving my money to a political advocacy group is charity. Like, all these things suddenly are up for grabs. And the people who wield a lot of influence here are able to redefine what charity means simply by calling a movement of money from one hand to another a charitable action. Yeah. I think that's a fascinating thing for us to be looking at, and it could profoundly shape a lot of what we think about as charitable activity. Yeah, it's also a real bear to regulate in terms of charitable activity too. So yeah.
It's interesting because it ties back to one of the things you started to talk about as the moral component of this. Right. You kind of dodged the religious aspects as well, right? And so if we think about the religious, some of charity and separating religion from state, that got mucked up. I think in one of your periods, the 70s, right? Like that kind of gets messed up. And when we allow we allow government funding to go to religious organizations, like that's a big transformation. Is it Bush and 1,000 Points of Light or something like that? Like there's a moment when those get blurred as well.
And I think there's a really fantastic question about, what do we think the meaning of the public good is? So, I know a good bit about the Omidyar move to an LLC, and part of it was because he wanted to preserve kind of family farms on the big island of Hawaii where he lived. And he also wanted to help agriculture, and so he could fund small businesses. And those businesses lost money time and again. So if we're trying to think of the imagery, this would be like Josiah Wedgwood in England in the 1700s, right? Cadbury in the 1700s, investments in a community where you live to keep that community kind of vital. There's an LLC here in the town of Los Altos, just below Palo Alto, that supports a children's bookstore, so that the children's bookstore can afford to exist in Los Altos, and it supports a bakery, so we can have high quality bread. The LLC pays the rent for those activities. There used to be a dumpling maker, but the old guy finally gave up on the dumplings, but his rent was subsidized by the LLC. So is that philanthropy? Is that charity? What is it? But who gets to decide that? We're kind of, probably most people on this Zoom call are reasonably content with the Washington Post having a backbone and a spine and being a feisty newspaper the past 4 years, thanks to Jeff Bezos's money. right? But if it had taken a different slant, we would probably be raising holy hell over that. So,
Well,
I probably should be mindful of time, right?
Right. I see we have reached our time. And what I want to say is that what surprises me in thinking about the state being replaced in its effect on doing good, especially Sweden and the foundation, is that the budget of the state is so vast compared to the money that is being spent by the foundations. Even though to us it seems like a lot of money, when you have the next bill coming up at $1.9 trillion in Congress, it's just it dwarfs the amount of revenue and resources that the foundations can muster for the different causes. So how does one begin to think about the idea that the foundation is a competitor with the state?
I would say that you shouldn't treat a dollar as a dollar. They're not necessarily commensurate because there's so much of how that money is used, the discourse that comes along with it, public expectations of how it's used. And I think that you can have an outsized influence even if you have less money. And we do seem to grant that to an elite few people who have a lot of money compared to us, but not a lot of money compared to us, right? So it's, I think that's a large part of that competition. And also the state and its budget isn't just existing in a separate sphere independent of civil society and nonprofit organizations. Philanthropists are often deeply involved in setting state agendas. And so how that money gets spent is part of that. And that money also is often getting mediated through public-private entities and going to nonprofit organizations. So that crisp line between state and civil society is always a bit blurry. So some of that number is, part of this very thing we're talking about.
Well, with that, thank you. Oh, Woody.
I don't know the number at Cornell, so I can't speak to Cornell. I've talked with Rick Levin about this at Yale, and I know it for Stanford pretty well. If you look at the past 25 years of funding universities, federal funding and state funding for universities has declined to elite rich universities like ours, maybe on the order of about 5 to 6%. Elite philanthropy during that period has grown from about 3% to about 22%. Okay, so that even though the federal money is somewhere around the 45% range, the growth where new sources of money, where new buildings come from, where new programs, where new hiring comes from, that's not coming from the feds. So you might think of the federal money as very much the brick and mortar money that keeps the thing going, but the new stuff, the tracks of the future, come from elite philanthropy in some very important ways.
Okay, with that, thank you very, very much for this wonderfully rich talk, and I enjoyed it very much and learned a great deal from the both of you.
Thank you very much. Nice seeing everyone. Great to see you.